This is Ervin Laszlo. On behalf of the Laszlo Institute of New Paradigm Research, welcome to our symposium. Just a word, a 3-day symposium on the most important issue ever faced by a community, by a civilization, the issue of survival. It's a civilizational crisis. It is a crisis of existence on Earth. It's a very different world that we are now confronting from what we thought it was. We thought the environment is just a background. It provides what we need. It takes up all our wastes, and it exists independently of us, and we can just draw on it. It turns out that the environment is our vital resource, and it's a delicate resource that is in question. We no longer live in a world that affords everything to everybody, no matter what we do. We are living in a world in which we are an endangered species, not a dominant species anymore, an endangered species. So politics in this world is very different from what it used to be. Politics is not about the power and advantage for a small minority against all comers, against rivals, against contenders. Politics is not just securing our advantage. Politics is to ensure that we can live on this earth, that we can thrive on this earth, we can even develop and evolve on this earth, instead of breaking down in chaos and crisis. This is the new politics, the politics of existence on the planet. We shall discuss many aspects of this, and without further ado, I will hand it over to the moderator of our symposium and director who has organized the symposium on behalf of the Laszlo Institute. Once again, welcome. I think the next 3 days could be important for you, for your life, and for humanity. Let's make the best of it. Thank you for having joined us, and all the best.
Thank you very much, Ervin, and thank you everyone for coming here to this extraordinary event, the Laszlo Institute of New Paradigm Research's Symposium on the New Paradigm in Politics. Ervin Laszlo, our founder and president of the institution, has so many credits to his name that it becomes a bit of a labor to list them all and beside the point. I think the most important thing to understand about him is that he's gone into the very core of the mindset of our civilization and explored it deeply with the heart and mind and soul of an artist, of a world-class, actually, concert pianist who decided to actually give up what would be a richly rewarded and richly rewarding career in music in order to deal with the civilizational crisis that he just described to us. We'll be hearing from Ervin in the session 2 here today. But for now, we want to begin with a bit of an orientation to the entire event. A wonderful team has come together to produce a 3-day symposium, this 3-day symposium, designed to draw all of us together into a collective that can begin to take action and emerge with many others like ourselves into a joint program of transformation to address the very emergency that Ervin was just describing. This is not a drill, and this is not an option. This is no longer a time when any of us can presume to be bystanders or non-participants. There is no way and no place to go anymore when the earth itself is threatened. And at the same time, we are living a time of the most extraordinary coming together of resources. As great as the peril, so is the opportunity. When we were inviting speakers to this conference, we quoted them from a great cultural historian of the mid-20th century named Lewis Mumford, who prophesied this moment, but didn't live to see it come about. And he wrote at one point, "Here and there in history, one notes a sudden concentration of energies, a more favorable constellation of social opportunities, an almost worldwide upsurge of prophetic anticipation, disclosing new possibilities for the race. So it was with the worldwide changes in the 6th century BC, symbolized by Buddha, Solon, Zoroaster, Confucius, and their immediate successors. Changes that gave common values and purposes to people too far separated physically for even Alexander the Great to unite them. Out of still deeper pressures, anxieties, insecurities, a corresponding renewal on an even wider scale now seems open for humankind. Today, humankind is like a mountain climber who must leap at its peril over a formidable crevasse. In order to continue our upward way and to make the physical jump, we will have to draw on all our personal resources. If we are too weak or cowardly to make the effort, we will freeze in our present position, unable to climb up or down until cold or terror or fatigue or some combination of these forces us to lose our grip and fall to our death. No small reluctant efforts will overcome the conditions that threaten not simply the advance, but the sheer animal survival of the human race. True, we have never made this leap before, and there is no guarantee that we will reach the other side. But the upward ascent now beckons as it never beckoned before, and above the parting clouds we can now discern the nearest of the sunlit peaks. If we have faith, we shall reach the other side. But first, we must take the measure of our dangers, for a halfway leap will prove as mortal as no leap at all. We're going to spend this first session actually doing that very last thing that Lewis Mumford advised, to take a measure of where we're at. And we have an extraordinary set of speakers to do that. But before I introduce our invited guest lecturer, Dr. Nafeez Ahmed, I want to describe to you the sequence of the program. And today we are every step of the program has abundant time for your participation through questions and answers given directly to the speakers live and in real time right here. We're going to go from this beginning assessment in the next 90 minutes or so, and after a half an hour break return to go deeply into the requirements in this new paradigm. Remarkably, this conference, this symposium, corresponds to the publication of a new book by Ervin, Laszlo, and Fred Zhao, two of the speakers who will appear in the second session. Their book, Dawn of an Era of Well-Being, New Paths to a Better World, is a direct address to the configuration of this time, the needs of this moment. And they actually complement the book of a third speaker, Mystical Gnosis by Arthur Bisluis, who I also introduced then, who together bring East-West contemporary science into a discussion that's never had before publicly about how the great threads serving and converging in our civilization can come together to offer us a unified and universal view that can penetrate into all the precincts of human culture. But to understand how that can come about and what that will be addressing, we first must, again, need to look at our circumstance. So I'm going to be introducing three speakers individually. The first one, I'm very pleased to have here, Dr. Nafeez Ahmed, a man who combines two careers in one body that I don't think that could be more timely for this moment. Because Nafeez Ahmed is not only a major award-winning journalist, investigative journalist, but he's also an interdisciplinary academic who specializes in international security and complex systems theory. He's a best-selling author. I can't even describe all the number of initiatives he's created, but they all go to the heart and soul of what this next 3 days is about. Citizen-led initiatives to bring us together around understanding our circumstance, dealing with our issues cooperatively, finding new methods beyond the old sclerotic, highly compromised systems of governance, science, business, and so on that don't seem today to be even close to being adequate to the demands of this emergency. He's been a voice, especially for deep interdisciplinary research into the systems and structures that impact our lives, along with the potential to change them for the better. And he's been an innovator in powerful ways to communicate this learning from such research to mass audience to facilitate coordinated actions. So I won't go through the list of his many awards. So rather than that, I would just like to present to you our invited guest lecturer, Dr. Nafeez Ahmed. Welcome, Nafeez.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Bill, for such a kind and generous introduction. And may I just thank everybody at the Laszlo Institute, including Ervin Laszlo himself. I'm personally a big fan of his work. So it's a huge, huge honor for me to be able to address you here and to open this really important symposium that you guys have organized. It's a huge delight for me to be able to do that, and I hope that I can do it some justice. So presumably I can share my screen. So the talk that I've got here called Global Phase Shift, Systems Frameworks to Navigate the Transition to a Post-Carbon Civilization. And this talk is really about trying to understand the moment that we find ourselves in now. And I'll just begin by setting the intentionality following the words that we've just heard. My intention in being here is really to be able to connect with all of you in facilitating us in being able to really kind of see and sense make what's going on at the moment, to develop a set of tools to do that, and hopefully to use that to develop a groundwork for inspiration for where we see ourselves going in the next few decades. So this talk really starts with you and where you are and where you find yourself. And what I'm going to do is begin by running through some really simple concepts in understanding systems. You find yourself as part of a system. You're not alone. And the general way of understanding system is really quite simple. That, you know, you have two interconnected things, maybe A and B, that they have to be connected. And there is a relationship not only between them, but in their environment. And that kind of essentially determines the nature of that system. I'm not going to get too deep into all of these things, but I just want to lay a bit of a groundwork. One of the really interesting concepts that has become quite useful these days is complex adaptive system, the recognition that there are these systems which actually adapt to their environment, they change. And it's one of the interesting things about organisms and people like you and me, and not just that, but also societies and economies, that they are complex adaptive systems. They're actually able to change how they operate. The rules in which they relate to each other can change in relationship to their environment. And as a result of that, we see these emergence of these new things. One of the interesting ideas that I use this very basic analogy to explain the idea of emergence. I always use the example of water because it's very simple to understand the idea that H2O, you get these different sets of molecules, put them together in a certain way, and then when you stand up and take a bigger look, it has the properties of liquid, which then of course enable and constrain the way in which the parts relate to each other. I mean, that's just a really interesting analogy to understand what we're talking about, how the overall structure of a system can emerge and then enable and constrain what happens at the individual level. So these are some really important ideas to understand. Now, this diagram, the reason I want to bring this up is just because I want you to take note of these four arrows: info in and info out. And this is really important because one of the things that everyone's going to be really familiar with is the issue of information. And one of the most important things we understand is how how any system, whether it's an organism or a society, the way in which it relates to its environment is obviously going to be determined by how it processes information about its environment. And whether it's successful in processing that information and using that information to adapt the way in which its different constituent parts operate so that they operate harmoniously in relation to what's going on in the environment, really determines whether an organism or a species or a society or a civilization is able to move through the kind of the turbulence of evolution and move through different stages. So this is very, very key. And we're going to come back to the role of information again and again, and certainly at the end. So we're going to we're moving the camera further and further out to have a bigger picture. We started with you, we gave some examples about systems and how they work. And you obviously are an individual and you're part of lots of different systems, family system, maybe the workplace environment, your wider community. And you'll find that there's you as a system, as a biological organism, and maybe a psychological organism, maybe a spiritual organism. You have all of these complexity. And then there's these amalgamations of other entities very much like you that you live with and work with and play with and grow with. And out of all of that, we have a wider human system. So we can see there's a huge multi-layered complexity going on here. And all of that, of course, enables and constrains what's going on at different levels. Now, the other really important thing that I want us to remember when we're going through some of the issues we're going to talk about is that we can't, because of this huge complexity, we mustn't make the mistake of trying to reduce the human system to any one thing. Often you get people who will say it's all about the economy, or it's all about relations of production, or it's all about the politics, or it's all about the ideology, it's all about this. And actually what we've now learned through system science is it's all of these, but not in a kind of silly haphazard way, but in the sense that all of these are fundamentally interconnected and interrelated. And changes in any one of these areas, whether it's ideology and culture, or politics, or the economy, we'll find that changes in any of those sectors will have ramifying changes across all of these other sectors. And that's why we find that change often takes place when it does happen quite rapidly. I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but one of the things we see here also, we're homing down into the production system, which is one of the sectors that we mentioned, is that even here in the production system, we find huge complexity. Materials, food, transport, energy, information, these are kind of foundational sectors of our production system. And changes in each of those will entail changes in others. But of course, information in a way sits at the center because much of what happens there has ramifying implications for what happens elsewhere. We're going to come back to some of those ideas in a minute, but now we're going to widen our lens a bit more. And we realize that the human system doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of an Earth system. And of course, we can even go wider than that, and we'll find that we need to by the time we get to the end. But we just stop here for a minute to think, the human system and the Earth system, we've realized that the human system is part of a huge complex Earth system, which consists of many different things. We're used to thinking about our economy and our society in isolation. Social media, what we watch on TV, all of these things, when we get absorbed into it, we can tend to forget that really all of these things, all of the things that are happening in this world are part of these, only enabled by our wider relationships to the Earth. And when we look a bit deeper, we realize that there's all this other complexity that's going on in the climate system, the way in which our civilization extracts energy and materials from that system. There's oceans and forests and soils, there's an atmosphere. And of course, we're very used to relating to the Earth system in a relationship of we kind of take the things that we need and we use those things to produce and to distribute goods and services in our society. But what we're starting to learn is that we can't keep doing that without really being conscious of the impact on the Earth system. We have to start to realize how reciprocally intertwined these systems are. One of the really important concepts that I'm going to use today is this idea of tipping points. And of course, I started this talk with the title of global phase shift. One of the things that happens within different systems is they can change when they reach a tipping point. And I'm sure everybody's heard of climate tipping points. What happens when, something hits the tipping point in the Arctic, or there's a tipping point in the Amazon. We keep hearing about these tipping points. And I guess the key idea is that a system can, when you look at how a system works, you can think about a set of relationships and you can kind of define those relationships with this idea that there are certain, we often use rules, this idea of rules and norms that determine how the system is operating. But what tends to happen in any of these systems is that when there is a lot of change going on at different levels within that system, sometimes it means that the rules begin to change. And that's when we talk about this idea of a tipping point, when that whole system the rules require kind of a recalibration. And what's really important to think about when we're talking about the idea of a phase transition is when we have multiple different tipping points occurring at different spaces within an overall system, which means that the whole system and all the different subsystems that it's made out of could begin changing because of all of those different tipping points that are being kind of breached and hit or crossed in different ways. And what's really interesting is that it's important not just to think about tipping points in terms of the climate system or the ecology, but also to think about tipping points in terms of society. Many of us have heard about behavioral tipping points and what does it take, you know, for a mass of people to then change behavior on a wide scale, but also to think about tipping points from a whole wider thing in terms of like culture and civilization. What I'm going to do now is run through really quickly some of the big kind of ecological tipping points that we're facing, which really speak to the reality that we are facing an unprecedented ecological crisis. I'm just going to give you a few examples that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but it's really useful to once again remind ourselves and situate ourselves and really kind of connect to some of these crises. So one of the well-known tipping points, I mentioned the Arctic, is this thing called the albedo effect. And it kind of gives us a sense of how these tipping points work. And this diagram really illustrates how simple it is that we can have global warming. We home in on what's going on in the Arctic. We have these higher temperatures locally as a result of global warming. And that results in the ice melting. When the sea ice melts, there's less sunlight that's reflected back. What that means is that then there's more heat which is absorbed. As a result, there's more open water, more sunlight absorbed, and then that results in further warming effect. As a result of the deeper warming effect, global warming overall is increased. And so you end up on this kind of reinforcing cycle. And I think what's really important about what we're learning when we're looking at complex systems is that the kind of linear thinking that A causes B, and that's kind of the end of it, is now broken down. We're now realizing that A can cause B, and then by itself, as a result of that forcing, B will then continue to act back on A, and it can create a cycle which continues even when you stop what's going on with A. And the danger with these tipping points is that if we keep pressing A too long, it may well get to a point where that A-B self-reinforcing amplifying feedback then continues even when we remove the original source of the forcing. In this case, of course, carbon dioxide emissions. And there are many different examples of these tipping points. This is a graph from the Potsdam Institute, which gives you an illustration of the huge number of tipping points. And this is not even all of them, but these are some of the key ones where there are these risks at our current levels of emissions in the atmosphere. Right now, there are these risks that these particular ecosystems could cross tipping points. I think the other key thing is that due to the complexity of these issues, we really don't know. It's very difficult for scientists to determine when and how we actually cross these tipping points. We're only beginning to understand the sheer interconnected complexity. And of course, it's not just the tipping points by themselves. It's what happens when, you know, maybe we hit a tipping point in the Amazon, and we're hearing already about how parts of the Amazon rainforest are now beginning to emit more carbon than they are able to absorb. It's beginning to cross that threshold. Are we out of control yet? We actually don't know. It might be the case that it's already past the tipping point. And sadly, we may only know after the fact when we've crossed too many tipping points. So we can't really afford to be waiting around. The idea of planetary boundaries is kind of a wider way of looking at this issue. It's a different concept to tipping points, but it again talks about the idea that there are these key thresholds. And this is 4 thresholds that in 2009, Will Stephan, the well-known scientist, and his team concluded that as these 4 particular thresholds around phosphorus, nitrogen, land system use, and fresh water use appear to have been crossed already. Now, the problem with crossing these planetary boundaries, again, is the unknown. Once we've crossed those boundaries, we know that we're in deep uncertainty, but we're just not sure at what point that uncertainty begins to get out of control. But the key message that these scientists who innovated this new framework for understanding planetary boundaries, is that they said that once you cross planetary boundaries, you're really shrinking the space for human habitation during the period known as the Holocene. That period of hundreds of thousands of years when we had stability in the Earth system that was so wonderful for life to flourish is now slowly shrinking as we cross these planetary boundaries. And the idea is that if we cross all 9 of these boundaries, and we can see all of them listed here, then the risk is that too far into those crossings, into breaching those boundaries, then we get to a point where we may trigger what they call the hot house Earth scenario, which is a runaway warming effect where all different tipping points and different boundaries are crossed in such a way that we begin to lose control. And no matter what we do at that point, there is a risk that these unfolding tipping points then will then continue, and we could end up in an unmitigated disaster in an uninhabitable planet. And in that scenario, it's a worst case scenario. We don't quite know when and how that might happen. The best science tells us that 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees is kind of where that danger zone is. And once we begin to cross into that area, those uncertainties become bigger and bigger. And and the risks higher and higher. And we're in that danger zone right now. So I'm going to run through a couple of other graphs, which are going to give you a sense of the state of acceleration that we're experiencing right now. Again, all of this stuff will be quite familiar to you, but I think it's the way we think about these things that's really important. So first of all, of course, we know that we've been exponentially increasing global carbon emissions over the last few hundred years that our industrial civilization has existed. We've seen that this dramatic increase in carbon emissions has been correlated with an increase in the way in which we are consuming. And I've used this graph of income levels to demonstrate that there is this connection with the way in which our economy is operating. We can also see this connection with energy consumption. So of course, something to do with our civilization. Our civilization is heavily dependent on fossil fuel resources, and there's been an exponential increase in our consumption of these resources, which is obviously fed into this escalation of carbon dioxide emissions. What's happened at the same time is we've seen this exponential increase in GDP growth. And that has, again, it's kind of got bigger and bigger and bigger, and we don't really know where it's going to go, except to know that the idea of infinite growth on a finite planet clearly doesn't make any sense. But one of the interesting things that happened in recent years, and I draw your attention to the date here because it's going to keep coming up. In 1970, we recognized that we began to overshoot. So we've been going down this trajectory of exponential growth in so many different ways, but we've realized that the rate at which we're growing is outpacing the rate at which natural systems renew themselves. And so the Global Footprint Network have come up with this really powerful metric showing that the equivalent consumption is something like 1.5 going on 2 planets. Colossal amount of consumption that we're doing, and it's not sustainable. At the same time, the other interesting thing that we've seen is, again, you look around the date 1970, we've seen that there's been a kind of exponential increase in the global debt to GDP ratio. And what's really ironic is that after 2008, the global financial crash, that debt ratio has actually increased. So instead of solving the debt problem, we've escalated it. While all of that has happened, the other interesting thing that's happened is there's been a strange inflection, and it's not because we've wanted to do it, but we've actually seen that in recent years, since around 1970, around the same time when we've had this inflection point with overshoot, there's been a decline in the rate of GDP growth. And this has been particularly marked in some of the most powerful industrial economies, Japan, Europe, and the United States. Again, it's kind of really taken off in the 1970s, and it's kind of escalated since then, this decline. And of course, kind of global growth kind of plateaued since around 2008, and we've again experienced a kind of rupture in growth since the pandemic that erupted last year. There's also an interesting correlation with energy, oil, and GDP, which I mentioned before, which is we've seen it again throughout this period. And that's just another graph to illustrate where we are right now in the wake of the pandemic. There's something really interesting is happening here. And there's this really important concept, and I'm going to bring all of this together in a moment, this idea of net energy decline, the concept of EROI, energy return on investment. And one of the interesting things that's happened is that we've seen that the global EROI has begun to decline around that same time, 1970. Now, what does this mean? Energy return on investment is this pretty simple ratio, but it can be complicated to really make it right, that tries to measure the amount of energy that we use compared to how much we get out. So we're using a certain amount of energy to extract fossil fuels from the ground and to convert that into useful energy that we can use in our societies. And what we've found is that we're using more and more and more energy to get that energy out. And as a result, the efficiency has declined. So that's also been an underlying issue that's been going on since around 1960, 1970. We've seen the total fossil fuel system going on this decline trajectory. At the same time, we've seen this huge increase in global inequality. And one of the things that I think is happening is that as we've moved into this trajectory of escalating consumption, escalating exploitation of energy resources, driven by this ideology of material consumption, we've moved into this space where the Earth system can't sustain it anymore. And as a result, we're kind of cannibalizing ourselves. So we've been cannibalizing our energy system in order to keep going. And as a result, we've also been increasing these environmental costs by pumping the CO2 into the atmosphere, all of which is increasing the overall costs on the economic system. And so the overall effect on that is that there's been a decline in GDP and an escalation in the kind of crisis potential. At the same time, in order to deal with this, our kind of financiers and our big investors and our kind of elite policymakers, their response is more business as usual. So what they've done is they did this ingenious thing in 1970, where they said, we're going to create credit as an instrument of profiteering. So rather than just continuing kind of the same way of doing capitalism as was done before, what they said is, one, we're going to outsource to poorer countries for cheaper labor and cheaper raw materials. And two, we're going to try and lend to people. And what a wonderful way of making money. If I just lend to people and they have to pay me back on interest, I don't have to do anything. I just literally create money in a computer and they have to pay me back on interest. And as a result of this reliance on financialization, we've had this huge escalation in debt. And we've kind of offset the debt to the future, to future generations. And so what we're really doing, what that debt really represents, and what no one talks about, is that's ecological debt. We see it in monetary terms, but really it's a debt that later generations have to pay. But increasingly, we're having to pay now when we see it in kind of the wildfires and the floods and the extreme things that are going on. But that debt is going to come back. And one of the manifestations of all of this, of course, is the increase in global income inequality, which has been absolutely horrendous. The other interesting pattern that we've seen is that there's an increase in the intensity of economic recessions. This is from a study in Nature Scientific Reports. Tim Jackson is a very well-known ecological economist, and they kind of track this. As you can see, this is quite a marked increase over the last few decades. In particular, again, from after the Second World War, but I would say from the 1960s onwards, and especially from 2000 and onwards. So what do I think is really going on? I use this idea of phase shift. I believe that what's happening right now is we're experiencing fundamentally a transformation of our global system. And really what I've done here is spoke only about the negative side of that. And the negative side tells us that when we're looking at our society and the escalating levels of polarization, when we're looking at our economic system and the increasing wealth gap, when we're looking at our culture and the culture wars and our inability to have constructive conversations, when we're looking at our economies and we're looking at and fundamentally our ecological relationship, our relationship with nature, we're seeing this widening gap and it's escalating at an accelerating pace. But all of these tipping points are slowly being breached or on the verge of breaching them. And what that really suggests is that the whole system is going through this fundamental change where the rules and the relationships and everything is up for grabs. And that could be a really exciting thing. But right now, on our business as usual trajectory, it's a very dangerous thing. One powerful framework to understand the moment that we find ourselves in was produced by Thomas Homer Dixon, a political scientist in Canada, came up with this idea of synchronous failure. And I think the big risk that we face from a civilizational point of view is what happens when all of these things kind of kick off at the same time. And what we see, what Thomas Homer Dixon tried to get across with this powerful diagram, is that really, you might have a blip going on in the food system and a blip going on in the climate system. But when they happen at the same time, it could overwhelm the whole system, because while you're trying to firefight with the food system, you then have to firefight with the climate system at the same time. And suddenly your capacity to deal with these multiple fires your system is overwhelmed. And that leads to a multi-systemic crisis, which overwhelms the system even more. And of course, we all remember that this happened in 2008 with the multiple crises. We had the oil crisis, we had the climate crisis, we had multiple food basket failures, and so on and so forth. All of these things kind of kicking off at the same time. The other danger that we have, and this is a little diagram which kind of, I want to illustrate the relationship between the Earth system and the human system from a kind of, again, from a negative point of view, is what happens when we get locked in an amplifying feedback process from a global scale. And this is the big danger that we have, that an Earth system disruption, such as the ones that I've described, it can trigger a shock. And you can think of any of the things that have happened over the last few weeks, and that shock could trigger a systemic breakdown. The danger is that a systemic breakdown, instead of triggering a proactive response, a collective intelligence response, it triggers something else, something that we saw, for example, with the emergence of the Nazis, something that we saw in Rwanda, something that we saw, with the election of demagogues and the rise of populist politics, otherization, where we blame particular groups and we focus on what's in front of us, the material, the skin color, the fact that someone says Allahu Akbar or whatever it might be. You focus on something that's in front of you and you say that's the problem. And the danger is that when you do that, you focus on that narrow issue, and instead of dealing with the real issue, you have a conflict. Meanwhile, while you're embroiled in that conflict, the real issues are still there. They're ongoing. The Earth system is there. The human system is there. You're really ignoring what's going on in those systems, and that crisis is rumbling away. And so there you have another shock and another trigger. And in fact, what you found is that you're so embroiled in your culture wars and your conflicts and all of that, that you're incapable of responding and understanding to what's going on. And so there's another Earth system disruption. And then the danger is that we get locked into a self-reinforcing amplifying feedback on a global scale. And that is essentially what collapse looks like. The collapse of civilization is not necessarily something which happens overnight, but something which takes place over a long, protracted period of time. And the people inside it maybe don't even know what's going on. But there is a lighter side to this. And this is where I really want to get your attention, is this idea of the adaptive cycle. Now, C.S. Holling was a very well-known ecologist who came up with this concept from the study of natural systems. And what he noticed is that natural systems go through this life cycle in all of their phases of life. And we can see this in biological organisms, we can see it in forest ecosystems, you can see it everywhere. And it's wonderful. And it shows that in every life cycle of a natural system, it goes through this phase of growth and then kind of conservation. And then there is a kind of a breakdown, and then there is a release of energy, and there's a reorganization phase, and then the life cycle begins again. And this is kind of the natural cycle of life. And when we map that adaptive cycle in kind of like a kind of temporal chronological sequence, it's even more insightful. We can see how these things kind of make sense. And you just imagine that this is a society or a civilization, and then you can begin to see how it might make sense for a human civilization. There's the idea of growth, conservation, release, and reorganization. So if we accept my contention that we are indeed in the middle right now of this momentous global phase shift, then what that suggests is that we have gone through this first phase of growth, and that we've now we've moved into the conservation phase. And maybe around 1970s to 2000, that conservation phase began to weaken. And as we've moved now from the 20s from the 2000s into the 2020s, I think we're maybe at the beginning phase of that release stage, and we're kind of sliding down and moving down. And then there's going to be what we're heading towards and we're going to see more this reorganization phase. And what's really interesting and exciting, and it was the systems theorist Jeremy Lent that first really opened my eyes to what this really means, is that what it means is that we're seeing the old system breaking down. And we mustn't confuse the old system with ourselves, which is something that spiritual traditions have been trying to teach us for many, many years, for centuries and millennia. And we mustn't become attached to those things that we see around us, the politics, the economics, the ideas, the society, the way we do things. It's those old industrial, linear ways of seeing the world that are breaking down and the systems associated with them. And as it breaks down, it's losing control. And as it's losing control, there is this huge opportunity space, this massive, unprecedented possibility space that is going to open up and is opening up right now. And that space is where we plant the seeds for the next life cycle, for the reorganization of the human system. And this possibility is now happening for the first time in human history on a global scale. We know that human civilizations have risen and fallen in history over millennia, and they've gone through this same life cycle. But never before have we been able to look back with all the tools of knowledge and history and science at our disposal to understand how we got to where we are, and to make sense of it, and to make decisions about it, and to have conversations, and to say, where are we going to go next? And to really see it and sense make and envision what's going to come on a global scale. We've seen it happening in different nations, in different communities, in different tribes, but now for the first time, we're experiencing this phase shift on a global scale, and it's momentous. There are many, many different dimensions to this phase shift, and I'm going to basically focus on only, first of all, one side. I'm going to dwell very briefly on the technological side, and then we're going to talk about the implications of that. There are some positive things happening on the technological side. But in order to understand what those technological things are, we have to realize that technology cannot save us. Instead, what we've realized is that we've found ourselves at this moment where we ourselves as individuals have to play a key role as disruptors of the old paradigm and as agents of regeneration. How do we usher in an adaptive response? How do we usher in and really make the most of this opportunity for breakthrough change? What our civilization has done is provide us with some powerful tools that we can use, which is very, very interesting. So nobody can say that we can't take a leap forward, that we don't have the capacity, that everything's just going to collapse and it's just the end. There's a couple of interesting things that I'd like to draw your attention to. One is that we now know that technology disruptions and societal disruptions can happen very, very fast. And I'm just going to give two very simple examples of this. One is the replacement of horses by cars, which happened in the 1900s. And there was a time, for example, over millennia, when no one would think that we could travel without horses. Horses were the dominant mode of transport for the vast majority of human civilization. But suddenly there was this convergence of certain technologies that came together, and the right things happened at the right time in the right way. And as a consequence, finally, the automobile combined with the automobile assembly line and various other things. And it all came together so quickly. And then within 13 years, no one was going around in horses and cars took over. Now, what's really important to realize with this example, I've also given the example of digital cameras, but let's focus on the horse example. There were benefits to that, of course. Going around in your car, it transformed our societies in so many ways. It transformed logistics, transport, how we eat, how we deliver, how we work, how we commute. It transformed the design of our cities, but it also brought with it horrendous systemic ramifications that no one thought about. We ended up becoming so dependent on fossil fuels. We ended up pumping so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It transformed our ability to make war on each other. We created new tools of war and killed so many more people. So the important thing to realize is technology is neutral. We have found that we've got greater capacity to do things, but we need to think really clearly, and it's really up to us about how we do that. And on that note, I'd like us to think about what's happening over 3 key areas of the production system right now. Wright's law tells us that some of the changes in disruptive technologies can happen very, very quickly, like with cars. Some changes take a long time, but specific types of technology can take place and take over, and due to economics, in a matter of 10, 15 to 20 years. You can think about things like smartphones or microwave ovens to see the kind of changes that they can implement. Now, the only reason I'm bringing this up is because of the tremendous implications that it implies for our opportunity to act. First of all, let's just go through these 3 or 4 sectors that I think are really important to understand. One is the information disruption that's taken place. We've moved from this kind of position of kind of centralized hierarchical control over information, which still exists, to this kind of interesting disruption of information where more and more people are now able to become owners and distributors of their own content. And that's been enabled by some of these things like the smartphone, the internet, and things like that. But we're moving into this interesting space where there's been this information disruption, which has changed the information landscape. It's had its positive, but what we've also seen is it has huge negatives, because there's a question of our maturity as human beings and our ability to dialogue and our ability to use this information disruption to make sense together of what's really going on. And what's happening right now is that we've learned that as a species, how deeply immature we are. And we're incapable really of taking advantage of this really interesting and powerful moment. And instead we're fighting with each other, becoming more polarized. But there are some other interesting things that's also happening. In the energy system, there's a huge disruption that's taking place. One of the exciting things happening with solar, winds, and batteries suggests that in a matter of decades, these renewable energies will become cost competitive, in fact, and many orders of magnitude cheaper than conventional fossil fuels, which is an exciting prospect. Another thing that's happening is in transport, that there is suddenly this opportunity to switch to electric vehicles, and which again could maybe transform things in many different ways. Oops, there was one more slide that I kind of missed back. I'm trying to get back to. There's another interesting disruption in food that's taking place in regard to precision fermentation, which is this ability to program protein molecules and to make any kind of to brew any kind of protein that you want without needing to use animals. And again, the cost curves on this are again really, really exciting. The costs have already come down over the last few decades and are being used in certain materials and cosmetics, and they've come down exponentially. And if that continues on that rate, again, we're looking at huge dramatic cost reductions, which could make this kind of technology available everywhere. Now, one of the interesting things about I would like us to envision for a moment what could happen in the future. There are various scenarios. One scenario is that we have the Facebooks and the Googles of the world that continue to try to monopolize these technologies. And we get lost in culture wars and information wars and people trying to dominate the new energy system, that we have, kind of wasteful industrial practices to do with mining for renewable energies, and so on and so forth. Another way, however, is to rethink what the potential is. For example, if we're switching to electric cars and cars become really, really cheap, one of the potentials is that people don't need to own cars anymore. They just they're so cheap to use that means there's less cars on the road because cars are being used more often because of the longer life cycle of batteries. That could mean less need for steel. That could mean that we don't need huge oil and gas infrastructure. We can recycle it and repurpose it for all other types of things. It also means that we could focus on rewilding when we have less land used for livestock farming. We could do new types of carbon sequestration. We could think about agroecology. There's lots of blue skies thinking we can think about when we start imagining the possibility of a new system. But there's one fundamental sticking point here, and that's that our organizing system needs to adapt. Technology is just tools. And what's really interesting is that at this moment of great phase shift, our industrial civilization has produced simultaneously across these multiple sectors of the production system. We found that there are these disruptive technologies which hold some potential to change the way we do things. They're not going to change everything. And that's, I find, very interesting. And we find we're really in the middle of these multiple tipping points. There are these devastating ecological tipping points. And there are these really interesting social, behavioral, and technological tipping points. And it's all happening at the same time. And all of this adds up to the idea that there is this huge phase shift. But what do we need to do to really recognize what's going on and to kind of move into a new system without making the mistakes that we've made before? We have to change the way we see things. We have to change the way we do things, because it's quite possible that we could move into, we could take certain types of technology and we could take certain types of thing, and we could end up creating another dystopian system that only benefits a few. And if we don't do it in the right way, if we don't act in the right way with the right speed, we could end up finding that everything around us collapses before we're even ready to transition to something else. So in order for us to really move forward, the biggest, most fundamental shift that's taking place is really about our value system. And for me, one of the most important things is in the sphere of ideology, and how ideology has fed into many of the other ways of doing things. And what we've now realized is that the ideology that we've had that's kind of animated this old system has been reductionist. It's reduced human beings to atomistic, disconnected individuals who must compete for material consumption at ever accelerating rates. But what we're seeing, what all of these signals are telling us, these signals of tipping points, all of that information that's coming at us from our relationship to the natural world and to each other, these are all signals telling us repeatedly that your old paradigm, that this old way of doing things, this system that you've created, this way of being in the world, this way of seeing the world is wrong. It's dysfunctional. It is leading to your potential extinction as a species on planet Earth. So what more greater evidence could we have from an empirical point of view that a worldview which is based on love, that is based on compassion, that is based on generosity, that is based on cooperation and coming together and collective intelligence, that such a way of being in the world is actually objectively going to harmonize us with the world around us? And what does that say about that value system? That is a value system that has objective, evolutionary, functional value. It's real. There is something real about these values, about love, about compassion, about justice, about generosity. These represent behavioral patterns that can genuinely connect us with each other and with the natural world. And it's by adapting our system to those values that we will find a way through this phase shift and be able to create a wonderful new life cycle. And I've listed here all the areas that we need to be thinking about in this new paradigm of politics. It includes energy, but not just, let's just have renewable energy and let's just have solar panels on the roof. No, we need to think about what this means for a decentralized, local, participatory energy system. How are we going to share and exchange energy together? And obviously the same with electricity, smart microgrids transforming our urban infrastructure. How does that change how we think about supply chains? That we need to start, if we're going to embrace this value system, then we need to move away from wasteful practices towards circular economy principles, where we recycle, where we think consciously about reusing as much as we can, rather than simply kind of fast fashion, wasting, throwing things away. And also thinking about how to move for local, small manufacturing to empower people in their communities. And it's the same thing with jobs. We can rethink jobs. Instead of thinking about a relationship where we as individuals are kind of wage slaves working for giant companies, what happens when these new tools and ideas allow each of us to become producers of food, water, technology, and energy as part of the system? How does that look? How do we make that work? What does that mean for jobs? We have to think about money. We have to rethink how we do money, because we've seen that the debt system doesn't make any sense. We have to rethink how we exchange. We have to think again about how we organize our companies, moving away from a focus on just purely on profits towards a more inclusive and cooperative economic enterprise. I don't know whether that means we completely jettison profits or not, but there are many other things. And I realize that I think William has indicated to me that we are out of time. And on that note, I will simply say thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. And I hope that this gives you some good food for thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nafeez. Food for thought, I'd say a feast for thought, and a very excellent briefing, really, for A Planet in Peril, and also a preparation for where the trajectory of this symposium will go, because we're going to stay on this theme of where we're at right now in this session, but know that this is a preparation that actually moves on to very much in the direction that Nafeez was indicating of where we are going to. And in the next session, we're going to consider the principles of it. And in the session that follows and that concludes today's program, we're actually going to meet with some of the real activists, intellectuals, and workers who will describe to you some of their own initiatives and engagement in this world at various levels, from the local to the international, and give us a feeling for what it is when we all come together and congregate can actually be done. Our next speaker, Istvan Teplan, is part of the executive committee of the Laszlo Institute, and an illustrious academic and actually public servant intellectual, very much in this area of environment and communications. Istvan Teplan is currently the co-founder and president of the Prosum Foundation, which I think everybody will be glad to learn is tasked with dealing with one of the most great urgencies of our time, which is the provision of reliable public information so that we as citizens and as a community can make responsible decisions that are properly informed. But his background beyond that is vast. If I tell you that he's the co-founder of the Central European University, now under stress from the government of Hungary, but still one of the real lights of education in Eastern Europe, or that he's been a minister of the environment involved with not only the state of Hungary, but the European Union, and many other credentials, too time-consuming to present, and without taking away from the time that he has to present to us. I'd like him to also brief us on the political situation right now that we're facing in the world. Istvan, welcome.
Thank you so much. And I was asked to react quickly to Mr. Ahmed, and it was a very interesting and inspiring thoughts. However, I hate to say this, but I fundamentally disagree. I fundamentally disagree with what you said, not the content, but the approach. Especially the end, what you said, and I see much darker, you see, the situation. I don't think that there is any, philosopher's stones or some Eastern wisdom or a salvation theory which will solve the today's situation. I don't think that we agree that the most important factor in the crisis is us, is people. And I don't think that there is too much adaptation towards good things. If we adopt, we mostly adapt towards orient toward the bad thing, and this is also true with the Eastern countries that I know. It's very, very marginal, the real effect. And And I really like when you mentioned that which way is the world is going. I think it's going in a very bad way. There are 194 countries which has some kind of government in this world, and only 20 of them are full democracies. Good or bad, but 20 of them are full. Maybe 50 of them are flawed democracies. The rest are non-democratic. And you kept saying, you know, these nations, that nations. I really think that the only solution is finally get rid of this whole idea of the global organization based on nation states. I'm long convinced, and this is not kind of you know, my Marxist upbringing. I'm more convinced of this than I was then, when I was protesting against those ideas. But if you look at the superpowers who are, you know, running the world, most of the superpowers are not democratic. The US, hopefully after Trump. The EU is not a superpower. It's a nice idea, but it is not a superpower. All the big ones, Russia, India's Modi, Modi's India, Erdogan's Turkey, Bolsonaro's Brazil. So I think the world is going into a very dark alley, And somehow you have to explain to me and to everybody how it will change. If we all enlightened, finally we're going to enlighten the dictators who run the world, because they do run the world. You know, we have just this huge spyware scandal in Europe. It's really going into a very dark way, and I don't think technology will help us towards the good. It will help us towards the bad, because there are combinations now, like China, which you never seen before. There is technological advancement, economic effectivity, a huge state control which you never seen before, and how you able to tackle this. And the other thing is when I was thinking, the only thing you didn't mention is the demographical tipping point. I never heard that there is a demographical tipping point. Ergo, if the resources are allocated mostly by, if I want to be simple, by the bad guys, and there is no demographical tipping point, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see that what kind of crisis you're going to run into. So I think we really have to focus on to understand that what are the social movements, global social movements, which can balance this very negative trend of emerging dictatorship, emerging authoritarian regimes. 2 or 3 authoritarian regimes are just about to pull the EU together. Not that the EU regulates them, the other way around. So it is like, you know, bad money pushes out good money. It's the same thing. So what I wanted to bring in just a food for thought. Of course, I don't have a solution, but I really don't see that, you know, we understand, we learn, we don't learn. I really don't see the learning. You know, I really don't see the learning. People have technologies that I'm absolutely non-convinced that they need. There are going to be more and more people, without being, you know, Malthusian here or anything. But you know, if you just read UN statistics, that even if the reproduction rate in certain countries are dropping, there is no tipping point in sight.
Istvan, I think you've made your point, and I want to give Nafeez a chance to respond.
Fine.
I know you have to leave, and we have one more speaker that's important. So I want to thank you. I want
to express that I found the lecture really interesting, and I hope Mr. Ahmed won't take me wrong for being on the critical side.
Not only that, I want to thank you on behalf of the entire symposium for inoculating the entire event against any accusations of offering a Pollyannish, idealistic view of our future. So you've accomplished that. Thank you. Nafeez, please.
Thank you, Istvan. Yeah, I mean, brilliant response. Thank you so much. It's very sobering, and I always welcome. I mean, anyone who reads most of my actual work as a journalist would probably have been surprised to hear me speak in the way I did today. I don't often get a chance to do that because they'll find me talking about all of the things that you're speaking about, Istvan, about the, you know, the devastation, that, you know, the kind of the dark age features of civilization and its collapse that we're experiencing right now. I think what's important is when you take a systems point of view, you can begin to see what the possibilities are and what the realities are. And what the possibilities and realities are is not at all to suggest that we are going to be automatically transitioning to some wonderful world of enlightenment. That's not happening. There's no automatic safety kind of escape that's going to emerge like that. And I think the important thing to understand when we realize that the idea of a global phase shift gives a sense of really two really critical things. One is that the current system is going to collapse. It is collapsing right now, and it's going to collapse. And it has a terminal point. And we can maybe extend that terminal point. We could maybe, kind of extend it out, or maybe it could come closer. And there can be various different ramifications around that collapse. That collapse could be existential, or it could be more tempered. It could happen very, very quickly and take everything out with it. Or, you know, it could be a protracted process that takes hundreds of years. And the science at the moment is telling us actually that we have maybe up on a business as usual trajectory, maybe up to the end of the century, kind of a maximal level of, you know, if we continue our current rates, we're looking at creating an uninhabitable planet within our lifetimes. So it's pretty grim. And I think that's the reality is that on our current trajectory, we are heading into what we're seeing. I think it's interesting you use the word dark age. And it's exactly that, because what we've seen with past civilizations is what happens. When they collapse, then there is a dark age. But the other thing that has happened with those civilizations is that there's been something that happens afterwards. Now, we find ourselves in a quite unique predicament, which is that this has never happened before on a global scale. Number two, we've never been able to see it before and really and have conversations about it and make sense of it before. So I think there are really a number of issues to think about here. One is that when you look at the odds, overwhelmingly, the odds appear to be against us. And it's exactly like you said, you know, when you start looking at the facts and the data and the statistics, everything seems to be against us, you know. But the first time, we've never been able before to actually look and map out all of these things that are going on and then say, wait a minute, we need to do something about this. Something needs to change. That's never happened before. You can go through every past civilization, and I can guarantee you, whether it's the Roman Empire or the Byzantine, or whether the Uruk or whatever it is, that they've never been able to see what's been coming. So we have an opportunity. And the other big opportunity that comes with a phase shift is exactly that when there is a release, there is a breaking down of the old system. And when there's a breaking down of the old system, there's an opportunity space, there's a possibility space. And what's really important is that we have to recognize the possibilities. If we, in our pessimism, focus on the dark age and say basically everything is doomed, then that is the self-fulfilling prophecy that we're stuck with. But if we say that that is what we're stuck with, if we continue on these exact trends and tipping points that you very rightly pointed out, of course, that's the warning. But the other thing is to realize that there is this huge possibility spaces that's opened up.
I'm going to stop you. I'm going to have to stop you there, Nafeez, because I think that's exactly the point. And I think this is exactly the tone and tenor that this opening session required. I have to apologize to everybody. This is the only session, because of the length of our introductory lecture, that we will not have live Q&A. However, please submit your questions. We will find a way to get to them in the time ahead. We have one final speaker that I have to introduce, Jeffrey Kripal. And this is actually part of the trajectory that you saw at the end of Nafeez's presentation. He was just bringing us there a moment about a new worldview, new values that are objective values. And this is a critical matter of an intervention in our entire culture. And of course, we are an educated and educational culture. And the penetration of the academy, of the place where we teach our children and where we share our knowledge and come to consensus, colleges, universities, all down to the high schools, is the critical transition point that we need to engage now. One of the most creative figures in that engagement is Dr. Jeffrey Kripal, who's not appearing here live, but who recorded a short talk with me just the other day. Jeffrey Kripal is the professor of religion and philosophy at an associate dean of humanities at Rice University, one of America's great universities. He's the co-founder of their GEM program, Gnosticism, Esotericism, and Mysticism, the first doctoral program of its kind in the country, and also one of the largest in the world, such programs. He's also a public intellectual who's very active with the Eszalon organization, and in his 11 books, he's covered everything from the human potential movement to UFOs in culture to comic books, finding the sacred thread that is being buried throughout our culture that he's looking to help emerge, as so many of other speakers. So I engaged him about this matter of our culture and politics and religion. And that also, Jeffrey's recorded talk will be our final moment here. I will come on thereafter and just say a word before letting everybody go to break. So, Jeffrey Kripal.
Thank you, Bill, for having me. You know, when I present my ideas abstractly, people often look at me like I have three heads. But when I explain those same ideas in the context of my biography, they make a lot of sense to people. And even if they don't agree with these ideas, they at least are understandable. So that's what I wanted to do today for the next few minutes. I want to move through four different ideas: religious exclusivism, religious inclusivism, religious pluralism, and what I call secret humanism, which is where I want to end up. The idea here, you'll see the ideas play out, but it's very much about what I call the flip, which is this notion of leaving one's own thought and one's own culture, one's own birth beliefs, one's own birth ideas, and looking back at them from outside, as it were, and realizing that human beings are human beings first, and then their religious or cultural identities and beliefs are built on top of that human foundation. And I'll explain why that's such a rare thing today, but I think it is becoming increasingly less rare and more pressing. So I grew up in the American Midwest, right in the middle of the U.S., in the state of Nebraska. I grew up in an agricultural community, mostly Germans of German descent, about a third Catholic, a third Lutheran, and a third everything else Protestant. all white, very homogenous. My grandmother's and grandfather's generation, Catholics could not marry Lutherans or vice versa. And if they did, all hell broke loose, as we used to say in Nebraska. By my parents' generation, that was less of a problem. And by my own generation, it was not a problem at all. Religious identity, particularly being Catholic or Lutheran, didn't seem to matter, and it matters even less today. So you do see a kind of generational shift or movement over the years, but it's still all white. It's still all German in that context. After high school, I went to a Catholic seminary. I actually wanted to be a monk, and it was there that I was introduced to this new idea called inclusivism. And I learned that the Catholic Church in particular was once an exclusivistic tradition, as many religious traditions still are. Exclusivism is a very simple kind of religious logic. It works from the principle that excludes other people and other beliefs based on one's own religious beliefs. And this was enshrined in Catholicism through a Latin phrase, extra ecclesiam nulla salus. So outside the church, there is no salvation, which was what my parents and my grandparents grew up with. There was a series of meetings in Rome in the 1960s called Vatican II that essentially reversed that or rejected that exclusivism and opted for what we call inclusivism, which is essentially a religious way of including other religious worldviews, but still based on one's own beliefs and principles. And so here, a tradition like Catholicism would say that there is salvation in Islam, in Judaism, in Hinduism, and Buddhism, but it's through the light of Christ. These are essentially unconscious Christians, and that people are still saved through classical inclusivism. And it's by no means restricted to Christianity. Buddhists, for example, do it all the time as well. You're not a Buddhist in this life, but if you live a good life, you'll be a Buddhist in your next life. That's inclusivism. You're judging and ordering, comparing based on your own Buddhist principles. That seemed a bit. That was an advance for sure from the earlier exclusivism, but it seemed a little too convenient to me, at least my 21 or 22-year-old self. And so I went to graduate school to study something called the history of religions or comparative religion, and I was there introduced to something called pluralism. Pluralism is this idea that actually no religious tradition has the full truth. The full truth exhausts or overflows all cultural and religious traditions, and every religion is essentially a cultural approximation of some singular, unexpressible truth. That worked for a while. Then I eventually got to California, actually, and began to study the California counterculture. I began to study something called the human potential movement, which morphed into what we think of as the New Age, which in turn morphed into what we today think of as the spiritual but not religious, or today the nones, the people who do not or refuse to affiliate at all with any religious tradition. I think today I would no longer call myself a pluralist. And the reason is it's too clunky. It imagines itself as somehow possessing the truth, and all of these religions are essentially different ways to get to this singular truth. So the image we're often given is that the religions are different pathways up the same mountain. I just don't believe that anymore. I think culture and religious practice and spiritual practice are really, really important, and that we're essentially marching up different mountains. These different religious traditions, these different spiritual traditions are all different mountains, and people are walking up them differently. And you get different things depending on what you believe and what you practice. What I do think, though, is that all of these mountains can come out of the same earth, as it were. I think the gods are us. I think belief, particularly religious belief, is a kind of projection, and that there's a kind of secret human or secret humanism behind all of these religious practices and religious experiences. And that's kind of where I am today. The way I think about religious pluralism, which I think is the topic of my talk, is I think about it through the metaphor, not of the mountains, but of a chessboard. And I think when most people think of religion, they're essentially on the chessboard. And there's white pieces against black pieces, or black pieces against white pieces. So if you're a Christian, you have to be somehow against the Hindu pieces, or the Buddhist pieces, or the Muslim or the Jewish pieces, or vice versa. So there's always contest, there's always conflict, because you're identifying with the pieces on the chessboard. I think if you study these things long enough and you live long enough, at some point you have to ask the question, why do we have to do that? Why do we have to keep playing that game? And it's really a game. Why do we have to identify at all as Christian or Jewish or Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist or whatever it is we identify as? You begin to realize that religious identity is itself the problem. And the solution, which is by no means easy and by no means clear, is to see this deeper kind of secret humanism that runs through all these traditions and is in fact their base. You essentially learn to stand up from the chessboard and to stop playing the game, and to essentially see the game as a game. And it's this decision, or this form of reflexivity, as we call it in the academy, that I call the flip. And I think it will have to be crucial to any new paradigm, to any new future civilization, because I think the challenge is, how do we affirm people's religious identities and religious practices without absolutizing them, or without pretending that they're the answer to everything a human being can ask or be. And we know, certainly from the last 20 or 30 years, that authoritarian regimes, demagogues, have aligned themselves very closely with exclusivistic forms of religion. Christianity in the US during the Trump years, a kind of Hindutva fundamentalism in India with Narendra Modi to this day. Really all over the world, you see a kind of upsurge of what we now call fundamentalism. That word, by the way, is fairly new. It was really just coming into the academic lexicon in the 1980s, was when I was in graduate school. But today it's widely used to kind of name not religion per se, but a particular kind of religion that excludes others, that interprets its own texts or revelations in a very literal fashion, and tends to see the past, or the religious past, as a kind of golden age. And I think what defines our present moment is a kind of turning around, not to deny the past, not to deny those revelations and those experiences of our ancestors, but to turn to the future and essentially say, there's greater truth in the future than there was in the past. The truth lies in the future. It does not lie in the past. And I think that fundamental shift, which is very hard, by the way, for people to make, is where we want to go religiously now when we think of a new paradigm or a new future culture. And I don't think, by the way, you can think of a new culture or a new civilization without taking the spiritual and the religious into serious consideration. I don't think they're separable. I think human beings are naturally spiritual, and they're culturally or socially religious. And you have to figure out how to engage that in a positive and creative way, and not just in a negative kind of naysaying way. So I'll end there. Bill. That's probably enough.
I thought today's session was just a brilliant mosaic to set up the rest of what we're going to move on to. I want to thank Dr. Ahmed, Dr. Teplan, and Dr. Kripal for all their talks and for their conversation with one another. Again, apologies, we do not have a Q&A. This is the only session that won't have it. We're going to take a 30-minute break, and when we come back, we're going to actually follow right on from what we just heard from Jeffrey Kripal and move into this consideration of the new paradigm with bringing three really extraordinary speakers, bringing together the three strands of contemporary science, Eastern and Western, and our inheritances from Eastern and Western worldviews, especially in their politics and cultural life, on what it's going to take to put together this new paradigm, and the emergent process that Jeffrey just spoke about there at the end of his talk, that is going to be occurring in this very symposium as we move through the trajectory of increased participation from you, and also increased discussion and analysis and actual working with new participatory means to show something of what this emergent process looks like and what we can be looking forward to developing together and with many others as we move ahead. So we're going to take a break now, a half-hour break. Please come back on the hour to meet with Drs. Arthur Versluis, Fred Zhao, and of course, Ervin Laszlo for this extraordinary conversation about the real basis of principles and practices in law and politics and worldview of what it really is to have and become have a new paradigm in politics. So see you then.